Welcome to Menopause Reimagined. I have a huge favor to ask you. We just dropped a brand new survey called Doctor Visits. I put it in the show notes below, and I would love you to take a minute. It'll literally take you probably 30 seconds to fill it out. There's only a few questions. And I would love to know, have you spoken to your doctor or healthcare provider about how you're feeling and your symptoms? And how did he or she respond? Let me know because your story matters, and I want to share your story with our community. I'm Andrea Donsky. I'm a nutritionist for almost 20 years, menopause educator, and menopause researcher. I'm also the co-founder of wearemorphus.com, a company that helps to empower you to take control of your health and symptoms with nutrition, lifestyle, supplements, and research. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Nicole Avena. She's an associate professor of neuroscience at Mount Sinai School of Medicine in New York City and a visiting professor of health psychology at Princeton University. She has done groundbreaking work developing models to characterize food addiction and the dangers of excess sugar intake. In addition to over 100 peer-reviewed scholarly publications, Dr. Avena has written several popular books. Her latest book, Sugarless, covers the latest science on sugar addiction and how to overcome it. Now, here's Dr. Nicole Avena. Welcome to Menopause Reimagined, Nicole.
Hi, it's so great to be with you.
I am happy to have you because we're going to talk about a topic that I am very passionate about, which is sugar. And I know you are too. And being a neuroscientist and a teacher and all these incredible things and a doctor, I know that you are passionate about how do we really take control of how much sugar we are eating. And so talk about what inspired you to write Sugarless, and then I'll ask you a whole bunch of questions from there.
All right, sounds good. So I got interested in sugar many years ago when I was a graduate student at Princeton. I was doing my PhD. I had literally just started, it was day one. And I was meeting with my advisor, and we were talking about what I might work on for my dissertation project, which is this like 5 year long, big project. And we had talked about this idea that, at the time, it was the year 2001. People were starting to talk about, the rising obesity rates and how this was a big public health problem. And I started to think about that in the sense that it didn't seem to make a lot of sense to me that it was a moral failing that people were obese, right? That, it was their fault. And that was kind of the onus at the time. And we started to talk about this idea, well, maybe something about the foods that we eat are making people addicted to them, and that's causing obesity. And sugar stood out as something that we heard a lot about as being an ingredient that's being added to so many different foods, and more processed foods were becoming available. And so we started doing a whole bunch of research experiments to test whether or not sugar could be addictive, just like drugs or alcohol could be addictive. And so if you flash forward, we published over 100 peer-reviewed journal articles on the topic of how sugar affects the brain, whether or not it can produce an addiction. And it's not just our lab, it's grown from there. And there's been so much research that's come out that suggests that sugar has a negative impact, not only in terms of promoting addiction, but also in terms of our physical health and our mental health. So I was inspired to write Sugarless because I really wanted to bring that information to people and help people to see how sugar can have a negative impact on our health, how it can be addictive, but more importantly, help use my background in psychology to give them the tools to get out of it and to figure out how to deal with sugar in our modern food environment.
Out of curiosity, what is your opinion on everything? I know that Oprah's been talking about obesity as being a disease. So what are your thoughts on what's being discussed now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it certainly is not a moral failing, just like we don't talk about people who have addictions to drugs or alcohol as it being their fault. It's a biological process that occurs that leads to an addiction. And I think in many ways, obesity is falling in that same path because if we look at our food environment, it's an obesogenic environment. It's promoting obesity. You really need to fight against the environment to not get obese in our modern food environment. And so I do agree that it is not the fault of the individuals who are obese, but I do think that it is the responsibility of all of us to know about the research and know about how these processed foods and these foods that are so common in our society these days can have an impact on our health. We can't just assume that because it's in the grocery store that it's safe and good for us. And I think
Mm.
that for the longest time, most of us have always just assumed that, oh yeah, if you can buy food in the store, it's food and it's good for you. But we now have different classes of food, and we need to understand the risks associated with those classes. And ultra processed foods, those with added sugars, fall into a very different class than the traditional things like proteins and fruits and vegetables.
And there's so many other things that we're exposed to. I know part of, so I'm writing a book now, as you know, because you are quoted in my book.
Mhm.
And so I appreciate that. Thank you. And what I found is that there are, especially as we go into perimenopause and menopause, there are over 15 different reasons that we're gaining weight. So food is definitely one part of the equation, but there's so many other things that come into play, especially as we enter into this phase of life. I'm curious, Nicole, what are your thoughts on sugar being addictive? Because when you scroll on social media, you have a lot of people who will say that it is addictive, and then you have other people saying that sugar is not addictive and it's not harmful to our health.
Well, I fall on the side of the camp where I believe it is addictive. I think that we are born with a biological propensity to like sugar, right? If you think about our hunter and gatherer ancestors, we used to stumble upon a berry bush, right? Once in a while. And if it was the right season and the berries were ripe, we would eat them all, right? Because sweetness was coded as being safe. Even breast milk, if you take a look at the very first things that humans consume, it's breast milk or baby formula these days. They're both sweet.
Sweet.
And
Yeah.
so sweetness used to be something that was associated with safety and something that we have a desire for. However, that's not the case anymore. Sweetness is pervasive and we're finding it everywhere. And I think that's part of the reason why people are so drawn to it, because we have this biological drive to consume it. But the problem is that the way that it's packaged these days is not good for our health. The sugars that we're getting from candy bars and all of these like processed snack foods and things like that are contributing to the negative health outcomes that we're seeing happening all over the world. And it was interesting. I'm sure you saw this statistic that came out a couple of weeks ago about how the World Health Organization has now deemed that more people are dying from obesity worldwide than are dying from starvation. And so, it kind of just goes to show us that, wow, like that's great that people aren't starving to death, but now we're dying due to overconsumption. And I really feel that sugar and the addiction piece does play a role in that. And that's something that I'm hoping, my book Sugarless will help people to understand more about so that they can reevaluate their relationship with these foods and decide how they want to have them in their life.
Can you explain the types of sugar that are the most concerning?
Well, the types of sugar that I find to be most concerning are the ones that we're seeing most commonly used. So, sucrose, high fructose corn syrup. What I'm not concerned about is sugar that comes naturally from things like fruits. This is a question that I always get from people who say, okay, well, if you're going to, get off of sugar, should you also quit eating fruit? And my answer is no, that's not necessary, because fruit can actually be beneficial to our health because it has fiber, it has other micronutrients. And the sugar that's in there, yes, there's sugar in it, but it's packaged in a way that isn't going to cause this abrupt release in dopamine that we have in response to eating all these ultra processed foods with added sugar in them. So I often suggest that, when we're focusing on what sugars we want to avoid, it's the added sugars. It's not the sugar that's coming from, eating a piece of fruit. If anything, that's going to help you, because if you're having a craving for something sweet, you can have a couple of berries and hopefully that'll help to satisfy it. But I think by and large, it's really these added sugars. And it's getting more and more difficult because there are so many different names for added sugar. The list is up to like, I think 280 different types of added sugars that are out there. So it's not like you can just, know the names of added sugar and try to avoid them. I don't know about you, but I can't memorize 280 things. It's quite a long list. So
Yeah.
it's hard for the consumer to really understand where these added sugars are, just because there's so many different names for them that are available.
Mm. Maltodextrin is a good example of that.
Right. And many of these don't sound like sugars, like agave nectar. I mean, that sounds like something that's really healthy, right? Organic, organic cane syrup, like that sounds healthy because it says organic and cane. But again, these are all really just code names for added sugars.
Yeah. It's interesting what you're saying about the fruit. Does that go even for eating a lot of the very sweetened fruits like pineapple and all of these tropical fruits? Because especially when it comes to more for blood sugar, or is that not really
Mm.
something that you look at it more from an addictive point of view?
Yeah, I think obviously if we're looking at this from the strict blood sugar standpoint, so people who are trying to manage their blood sugar, whether it's because they have diabetes or for other reasons, obviously different fruits are going to have different effects. I'm
Mhm.
coming at this from the addiction piece. And
Okay.
I really
Good to
think that,
clarify.
most people out there are not struggling with a sugar addiction because they're eating too much pineapple. It's
Right.
because they're eating too much of all these highly processed foods.
And it's good to qualify the difference, so that's why I wanna make sure that I ask that question. When it comes to sugars, one of the so in the book, I just, literally just finished the Unjunk chapter, which is chapter 9, and it's unjunking food additives, and high fructose corn syrup is at the top of our list in terms of, sugars to avoid. So that would be a good example. If you're in Canada, it's known as glucose fructose. If you're in the US, it's high fructose corn syrup. So that would be a good example. What did you find when you were doing your research? Did you go into the different types of sugar when you were writing your book, or was it more sugar in general?
No, I go into all the different types. And so I do break down some of the more commonly used sugars that we see in our diet so that people can understand why these things are used. I always like the history. I'm kind of a history buff. So I always like the backstory as to like,
Yeah.
wait, where did high fructose corn syrup come from? Like, why do we use so much of it? And so I go into, the history about that and how it, became like really a cheap alternative to sugar cane. We could grow it in the United States because we got plenty of room for corn here. And so it was a really easy way for the food companies to have a way to sweeten the products for much less of a cost. And so again, I think it's important for people to understand these differences between the different types of sugars that are out there. Even though they all can affect the brain in the way that can promote addiction, they all have these little unique differences. And so I think it's important for people to know about those so that, they can understand, where these things have come from and why we use them.
How much sugar should we be eating a day? If in I remember, doing research years ago, and read that we should not have more than, I think it was the American Heart Association, one of the associations was saying we can't have more than 24 grams of sugar a day, and this is added sugar to our diet. So can you explain a little bit in terms of, the quantity, how much we should be taking in, and then also I wanna go into the details about what ultra processed sugar is versus the more natural sugars like fruit sugar.
Yeah. So, in terms of the recommended amounts of added sugar, it's discussed in the US, depending on the different organization that you're listening to, but the universal advice seems to be no more than 6 to 9 teaspoons of added sugar per day. And so, depending on if you're a man or a woman, that's going to have like some variations. But overall, that seems to be the overarching advice. However, if you look at the actual consumption of what people are actually consuming, most people are consuming, between 17 to 22 teaspoons a day of added sugar. And so we're by and large consuming much more added sugar than what is recommended. And in part, that's because a lot of people just don't realize how much they're consuming. People are largely unaware of how much sugar is in most of the food products that we have available. People are unaware of it because either they're just not paying attention or they think, oh, because something doesn't taste sweet, it doesn't have sugar in it, which isn't true. There are many hidden sugars in our food supply and in products that we don't expect to be sweet can often have added sugar, and that adds up. Also, a lot of people just are unaware of the fact that it's so pervasive. It's in so many of the different things that we eat. And, again, when you add these things up, it seems like, oh, a little bit of sugar, a little bit of sugar there. When you put it all together, it's a lot of sugar. And I think that's where most people find that, they're consuming it in excess.
I think something that's interesting to note is from the taste standpoint that you mentioned that, oh, it doesn't taste like it has sugar, so it probably doesn't, is because many of us eat a lot of the artificial sweeteners. You have things like aspartame, right? You have things like sucralose that are so sweet. that when it comes to eating regular sugar, it actually masks the taste of regular sugar. You don't even think regular sugar is sweet anymore. So I think there's a bit of that in there as well, in terms of thinking, well, wait a second, it doesn't taste like it has it, especially if you're someone who consumes a lot of artificial sweeteners.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the introduction of artificial sweeteners made our sugar problem worse than it was before they were around. They came out as this, saving grace, right? That was allowing us to, have our sweetness without the calories. But like you said, there's so much sweeter in intensity. And now that many of them have gotten a bit of a bad rap and people are avoiding them, the problem is you want more sugar. Our tolerance to sugar has gone up over time.
Mm.
And I think having the added alternative sweeteners and these artificial sweeteners on board has certainly contributed to that.
Mm. You say that you love the history or understanding things. Can you explain sugar, where it comes from, and then what it means to have that ultra processed sugar?
Yeah, so sugar can come from a variety of different sources. We have, for example, with high fructose corn syrup, that originally comes from corn and it's processed. And, there's lots of different steps that go into creating, the sugar that can come from that. And we also have sugar in the United States that comes from sugar cane or sugar beets. Most of the sugar in the world is now coming from beets, in the sense that sugar cane is something that, we don't see as many sugar cane farms these days. But what happens is that, once we pull out the sugar beet from the ground, a lot goes into making it into the granulated sugar that you find, in your grocery store or on your table at home. And it's a highly processed product. I mean, just the process of making sugar or making something into a sugar involves quite a few chemical steps, and there's a lot that goes into it. And so I think that what we've learned over time is that, people will say, what are the sort of best sugars or the safest sugars? I think it doesn't really boil down to which kind of sugar it is. I think it's the dose. And I
Mm.
think that, it's really about reducing the amount of any of these added sugars that you're having, because, people will say, okay, well, what about honey? Honey's, a natural sugar. And I agree. Honey has properties to it that you don't get from high fructose corn syrup. Honey is antimicrobial. Honey, has other nutrients in it. But again, it's still an added sugar. And I think that when we're talking about from like, a public health standpoint, like how can we reduce our dependence on sugar? It's not going to come from just putting honey in everything and getting all these other sugars out. It's going to come from reducing our dependence on sweetness and making it such that we're not expecting everything to be so sweet. If you look at the grocery stores these days, I always, very rarely do I go down the cereal aisle, only if I absolutely need to just make a detour or get around somebody. But if you look at the sugar content, it's so many of the kids cereals especially, I mean, it's gotten out of control. And
Mm.
so it's
Loaded with
again
sugar.
because the tolerance has been going up and up and up. Our kids are being born expecting this level of sugar, and it's only going to get higher as time goes on.
So one thing before I ask you my next question, you mentioned that it comes from sugar beets. So does that mean we shouldn't be eating beets? Because I know some people might have that question.
No, so that's not the case. So beets can be a very delicious part of your diet. It's again, the sugar that we're getting from sugar beets is very different than, the beets that we're growing in the garden. So don't avoid beets by all means. Those are good for you.
So you're talking about tolerance and the fact that we could tolerate a lot more sugar now than we used to. How do we start coming off it? How do we reduce that tolerance so that we could stop eating as much sugar, especially for those of us who feel like, for example, after we eat a meal, I like to have something sweet after I have a meal, right? So, and I know that some people are like, "Oh, I'm not sugar people. I'm more like salty or savory. I'm a savory person," right? But how can we start to reduce that tolerance to sugar in our everyday life?
Yeah, that's where the challenge lies. And what I talk about in Sugarless is a little bit of a different approach than what you would typically think about when we think of something as being addictive. I mean, typically when something's addictive, we say, okay, well, if you're addicted to it, you have to give it up. You have to cold turkey quit it. Most people that have alcohol issues or issues with drugs, you don't say, oh, just use a little bit less drugs. You say, you have to stop using drugs. You have to stop using alcohol. I don't think that strategy is going to work for sugar. And
Okay.
we know it doesn't work because people have tried to do it and failed. Sugar is so pervasive in our society, and we have this innate desire to consume it, that cold turkey, just quitting it all, is not going to work. It's not sustainable. And so I advocate a harm reduction approach where, we're having less and less and less of it, and trying to identify places where we can remove it from our diet, swap it with other alternatives so that we can still enjoy the things that we want to eat, but just have less of it. The less sugar we have in our diet, the less negative the effects will be on our health and our mental health. And so I think it's really about starting off with the biggest sources of added sugar, which for most people are beverages. Most people
Mm,
have,
yeah.
sodas, juices, coffees, you name it, that have a ton of added sugar. And so that's the perfect place to start and figure out how you can modify those so that they'll have less added sugar or maybe no added sugar. That's ideal. And then go from there. It's really more of a process to reducing our tolerance. And you find it's so interesting when I talk with people who've kind of gone through this journey, they'll say, like, "Oh, wow, now when I try to eat something that I used to love, it's so sweet. It's like
Yeah.
aversive." And that's
Yeah.
because when you're able to interfere with that tolerance, you'll see exactly how sweet these things can be, and you really don't enjoy them.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And so maybe it's even if you enjoy your morning cup of coffee or tea and you put in, a lot of sugar or even a little bit of sugar, maybe try just lessening that, right? And over time, it's going to taste good to you and your body gets used to it. I remember, Nicole, when I was addicted to artificial sweeteners. Like if I tell you, I would go and I'd get a coffee and I'd put in like 5 or 6 of the little packets into my medium-sized coffee. Like I couldn't get enough. Diet this, diet that. I mean, it was a massive addiction for me. And I would think that actually, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on the artificial sweeteners addiction versus sugar addiction. So hold that thought for a second. But I remember when I was trying to come off it, it was hard. I could not get off it. But once I was off it, it took me a while, but once I weaned myself off, when I would even try it, I'd be like, whoa, this is so sweet. But I was so tolerant to it. I didn't even realize it. And I'm guessing
Yeah.
you're the same thing you're talking about sugar. So how do the artificial sweeteners relate to addiction the way sugar does?
Yeah, it's interesting. So what we're seeing from the research is that it's basically contributing to the addiction. The
Mm,
idea behind the artificial sweeteners and these alternative sweeteners is that, they're going to have sweetness, but not the calories or fewer calories. And the research is showing that it's still releasing dopamine in the brain. They're still causing people to, crave sugar. They're contributing to this addiction piece. So what I tell people who are in the throes of trying to get control over their sugar addiction is, if you are really that psychologically attached to the sugar, that the thought of, not putting it in your coffee is going to just make you not even bother with this, then use some artificial sweeteners if you have to. But it can't be the end point. You can use them as a crutch, but you can't stay on those crutches forever, right? And so I think that it's important for people to just work on reducing their dependence on the sweetness in our diet, whether it's from sugar or artificial sweeteners or these alternative sweeteners. I think that if people want to adopt this idea, like, oh, just use monk fruit and everything and you'll be fine. No, it's just use coconut sugar and you'll be fine. No, it has to be about reducing our dependence on the sweetness, because that's where the problem is. And when we look at
the
the
taste,
artificial,
the taste. It's the taste, right?
it's the taste, exactly. And when you look at the research, I mean, there's been so many clinical studies that have been published on the effects that artificial sweeteners have on appetite and on body
Mm,
weight. And in
weight gain,
individuals,
yes,
yeah, they
totally. Yeah,
contribute. They absolutely
yes,
contribute,
long
and they're
term.
not they're not effective for weight loss. So overall, I'd say avoid them and use them sparingly if you need to.
So I'm going to say one thing is don't, in my opinion, don't use the artificial stuff. I am not a fan of the aspartame or the sucralose or the ACE K or the saccharin artificial sweeteners, but I am a fan of the monk fruits and the erythritols and stevia if you need to. So like you're saying, like you were like, use the artificial sweeteners. I'm like, no, 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 don't use those. But yes, if you have to, try the alternatives. And that was actually going to be my next question is what are the alternatives that you recommend? Because you mentioned it
Yeah,
earlier. So I want to know, what do you recommend?
right. So it's interesting. I feel like we have this generational difference. Like, I'm just thinking about like my mom. When I talk about like artificial sweeteners, right? It was like the aspartame. Like, we didn't have, the availability of like monk fruit and,
Yes.
some of these sort of newer, non whatever I guess the category would be.
They call it non-nutritive sweeteners is like, I guess,
Non-nutritious sweeteners, yeah.
the
So
artificial
I'm
sweeteners.
thinking of like the older folks who are like, what are all these things? Like there's so many different categories now. So I kind of lump them all together sometimes, which I shouldn't. But yes, you're right. I would agree with you that, really we have more options these days. So yeah, things like monk fruit are a good option if you need to have that crutch. But I do think that it's important that people keep that in mind, that it has to be short term. You can't just, make that swap and say, okay, I'm just going to stay on this for the rest of my life. You have to work to reduce your intake of that too.
And also it's great they're great for baking, like, you can even use them when you're baking, so if you want something a little bit sweet, but and then exactly like you're saying, is just using less and less so that you're not dependent on these sweeteners, and you'll see it does come, like, I still like to use sweeteners, so I will sometimes use monk fruit or erythritol or stevia, I do like them, but I find that you don't need as much, first of all, because they are very sweet, right? So in just trying to go
Right.
down and down and down as much as you can to try to training your taste buds is really what it is.
Absolutely. Another one is allulose. Allulose actually for
Love allulose.
baking. Yeah, allulose can be really
Yep.
good for baking because it browns and bakes just like real sugar would brown and bake. And so that's one of the limitations of using some of these alternative sweeteners is that when you're using them for culinary purposes, like for baking and things like that, they don't quite always work perfectly. But allulose seems to be the closest thing, to real sugar in that capacity. And it doesn't have the same effect on blood sugar as a lot of the other ones do. So that's another one to consider as well.
Yeah, I love allulose. Actually, I'm just doing a lot of research on allulose now and interviewing a supplier of allulose for the book. So I love that you brought it up. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you think that is really important that you get across to our listeners, especially women who are going through perimenopause and menopause?
Yeah, I think it's so important that we get out of our minds around the weight side of it, about the body weight side of it. I think that's the issue for a lot of women who are going through menopause or perimenopause. It's that, we're maybe finding it more difficult to lose weight. We're finding that, our bodies are changing. And I really think that it's so important to just focus on health and strength. And
Mm,
with that's going to come weight loss if you need it, right? I think, especially as people start to crest into those menopause years, you're losing body mass in terms of your muscle mass all the time. And, making sure that you're retaining that is so important for your longevity and your wellness. And so I think, focusing on your strength and, really kind of getting your mind around that is a challenge. And I'm in the like I'm not in menopause yet. I'm 45, but I'm listening to the conversations around it because I know it's coming at some point soon.
could be Perry.
Yeah, I mean, it's so hard to know, right? It's like it's not like you wake up one day and it's just you're in it or you're not. It's like a progression, right? And so I don't know, I've had to really talk myself into this idea of like, it's not about how much I weigh anymore or if I, fit into a certain size clothing. It's the goal has shifted dramatically and it's about doing everything I can to be healthy and doing everything I can to stay strong. I've seen people who are in their 50s fall and break hips because they just didn't have the muscle capacity to like, catch themselves. I mean, I don't want to be one of those people. So I think that it's just important to kind of shift the mindset around that. And cutting out the sugar is a way to do that because you're making a more positive impact on your health. It's promoting your health, and that's going to help promote you to become stronger and really just support your overall wellness.
Would you say that sugar increases inflammation in the body?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. There's a lot of research on that. People who are looking, to decrease their inflammation when they cut back on sugar, it's really telling to see, changes in joint pain, changes in that brain fog that a lot of people experience when they're, trying to just think through things and they feel like they get confused and clogged up. When people cut back on the added sugar, it's amazing to see how the brain fog can dissipate, how those little aches and pains and creaks that we experience as we get older, they seem to go away. And that's again, I think, due to the inflammation that sugar can cause. And so, one of the best things you can do if you're looking for an anti inflammatory way to promote your health is to cut back on the sugar.
And that's really important for us ladies as for many of us, if we are more prone to inflammation as we go into this phase of life. So that is great advice. What surprised you the most when writing the book?
I think I was really surprised most by the research on the mental health piece with sugar. I
Mm.
think there's been a lot of evidence about the physical health, right? We know, yes, sugar contributes to development of diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and so on. But I really found it telling when I was doing the research and talking about the studies that have found the link between sugar and mood and how sugar can impact, mental health outcomes as well. And so I find that to be fascinating because I think, we're talking a lot more these days about mental health and how it's a spectrum, right? We go through different periods of life where we're feeling good, we're feeling bad. And knowing that what we're eating can contribute to that and has an impact is so important because having a healthy diet, yes, we want to support our physical health, but we also want to support our mental health too. And so, one of the best things that you can do for your mental health is to cut back on the added sugar because we know that it's linked to poor outcomes.
So you have this amazing book. And for everybody who's listening, I highly recommend buying Nicole's book, Sugarless. And we're going to put a link below so you can buy it if you want to read it. But Nicole, why would somebody want to buy your book? Why would they want to read it cover to cover?
I think that if you are living in the modern food environment, if you're living in this world right now, you want to know what you're eating, right? You want to know what the foods that we have access to are doing to our health. And I think my book's a great way to learn about that because I walk you through what's happening not only with sugar but with the processed foods. I think, this idea of sugar being addictive is so true and we have so much research behind it, but now we can see it coming into practice in terms of how it's manifesting in terms of our consumer behaviors, in terms of how, we're struggling with mental health issues more and more, how we have more and more physical health issues, and all this, again, can come back to simply what we're eating and what we're using to fuel our body. And so if you are interested in understanding that and understanding, how you can break away from the added sugar, I think that's the key for a lot of people is that, they know that sugar is bad and they shouldn't have so much of it, but how do you break up with it? Like, how do you do this? How do you navigate the social situations? How do you, say no when someone comes up to you and says, "Oh, look, I baked you a birthday cake. Here, have a slice if you don't want to have a slice." There's
Right.
all these sort of nuanceical things that happen in day-to-day life that contribute to our sugar intake. And I help people sort of see through those and how to walk through them and navigate them because it's a challenge. And, I think that people need all the tools that they can get. And the book's a great resource for that.
Given that 50% of the top 10 most common symptoms of perimenopause and menopause, according to our research at Morphus, is mental health and cognitive related, I think that it's really important that, not only for our physical symptoms, but also for our mental symptoms. Like you were saying, the mental emotional symptoms, it's important that we really think about our relationship or rethink our relationship with sugar. So thank you for doing this. And thank you for writing this book.
Oh, thank you. And I'm so grateful that you're helping to spread this message because really cutting back on sugar is one of the things that we can do that's going to support every aspect of our health. I mean, there's really no downside to it. And so even cutting back a little bit is a big step in the right direction.
Agreed. Thanks, Nicole.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Nicole as much as I did. If you did, please share this podcast because the more you share shows you care. Please consider purchasing her book, Sugarless. It's excellent, and I put a link below so that you can access it easily. And don't forget to fill out our research surveys that you can find, again, the link below to all of our 10 surveys, but especially I want you to fill out our doctor visit surveys, as I mentioned in the intro. Thank you for spending the last hour and a bit with me. I appreciate you, and I'll see you at the next interview.